Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Road to 2000. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and tonight I am both your driver on this journey and the Master Lab 2 champion. We just had a small invitational tournament here at the chess club called the Master Lab. It's the second edition, and I was fortunate enough to walk away the champion this time. So tonight, I want to show you a few of my games from that event, and these games are going to focus on a theme. So these games basically went in three very, very different directions, but I felt that they all had some stuff in common. So we're going to look at what happens when a slightly lower rated player than myself makes some weaknesses or some mistakes early in the game, and we're going to see the different ways that the game's developed from there. So to start with, I want to show actually my final game against Prateek Nemmali, who I think is around 2000 USCF. But due to some really good performances in his first V-Day tournaments, his FIDE rating is actually like 2199 at the start of the tournament. So kind of unclear how strong he is exactly. For sure, he's a young guy. He's going to be doing things with chess regardless. But in this 10th round, Prateek played this move e4 against me. We got into a Caro-Kann. He exchanges on d5. And plays this move knight f3 right away. So you can definitely play like this with white. It's not going to cause you any problems to play like this, but I do think that this move order does let black off the hook just a little bit. So does anybody know a couple of the two different ways that white generally plays these positions? What is white normally doing here?
C4 going for like B13 Caro-Kann.
Yeah, so c4 is the pan-off attack, and that is, kind of the more aggressive way to play. You go after this d5 pawn in the center. Things are going to open up really early on, and white's going to try to kind of kill you in the opening. But there's another very well-accepted way to play for an advantage with white here, one that takes a lot less risk.
Bishop d3, c3.
Yep, that's exactly right. You go bishop d3 in c3. And here, does anybody know the move? It's not this one, if you're really, really fighting for the advantage. So what else can you do, and why is it better than knight f3? What's the point of playing bishop d3 and c3 rather than knight f3?
So you don't pin. So I think it's queen c2 is often played here.
Yeah, queen c2 might be okay, but actually I like the queen here for the moment. Instead, we're going to develop this bishop with bishop f4. And the reason why this is better than playing something like knight f3 is it puts a really awkward question to black. And that question is, what are we going to do with this light squared bishop? Because we would love to develop it outside our pawn chain before we play the move e6. But due to the very specific move order that white has played, if we go bishop g4 here, queen b3 is going to be a very serious try for an advantage. And now white does not have to worry about any bishop takes f3 sort of shenanigans. So that's why I think if you want to play the way that Prateek is playing, it's a little bit better to go for this other move order instead. But in the game, he goes knight f3. Not a big mistake by any means. It just makes my life a little bit easier. I develop my knight. He plays c3. I play bishop g4. And now I don't have to worry as much about these queen b3 ideas because I can always chop on f3 and have a pleasant position. So bishop d3 in the game. Both sides are just going to finish development. Bishop f4. I'm not really afraid of trading off these bishops. Kingside castles, knight f6, rook e1, castles. h3 was inserted. I do not really want to give up my bishop for this knight just yet, so I come bishop f5, and knight b to d2. So let's just take stock of what's going on so far. Does anybody recognize this pawn structure? Of course, it's the Carlsbad structure. And so with that in mind, we already have some idea of what some common plans are. So with black, we have the e-pawn in the Carlsbad structure, I guess reversed Carlsbad if you want to be technical. So what are some common plans for black to play here?
Minority attack with b8, b5.
Yeah. The minority attack is probably the first one you guys are gonna hear about. So what is the minority attack? Just very quickly, if you're unfamiliar. That is when you use your pawn minority, in this case the A and the B pawns, to attack a pawn majority and try to provoke some weaknesses. And we're going to see a really great example of this plan a little bit later tonight, so I won't go into too much more depth there. But what else can black try to play for here, if not the minority attack? Is there any other plan?
e5 pawn break.
Yeah, f6, e5 is also another way to play. And this is what I normally try to play with the white pieces, for example, when I get this structure with colors reversed. But outside of that, with the black pieces here, we're more concerned with just making sure we're surviving the opening, becoming fully equal. And so what I played in this position, which maybe it's not the most accurate move, is actually bishop g6. And the thinking was, this is white's best minor piece. If I can trade this off, then I don't really see a reason why I should be much worse. So Prateek agreed, and agreed that he should be trading, and took on g6. Not really worth it to try to save this bishop, because once this bishop moves away, now my minor piece is very, very strong, and your piece has lost a lot of its power. It's really just this d3 square that's super annoying. So bishop g6, he takes on g6. It also would have been totally fine to play something like knight f1 and allow black to make the trade, but rather than valuing this tempo to activate the queen a little bit, Prateek valued messing up my pawns just the slightest amount, doubling these pawns, making it a little bit harder for me to control some squares like g5, for example. The game continued with a4, so Prateek was very much anticipating a minority attack, and before I even hinted that I wanted to play the move b5, he was sort of aiming against it. So I just play simple chess, bring my rook to c8. It's a half open file. I might want to put a knight on c4. I still might want to play for a6, b5. Prateek plays queen to e2. So once again, very much guarding against the minority attack. I play a6. I don't know if I'm going to play b5 just yet, but it's nice to have the option. And then knight e5. And so then this is where I want to sort of pause again and take stock of what's going on. So we're playing with the black pieces. Our main idea is to go for this minority attack, but white is pretty heavily trying to stop us. Our opponent has just put this knight onto the e5 square. It's going to be a very strong square for his piece. And we've organized our rooks sort of on the queen's side, aiming down the c file. So rook might want to stay here. If the a file opens up, might want to come to b8 to support b5. And now I need to sort of take some time, figure out what my opponent is trying to do. So thus far, very normal opening moves. Prateek is aiming against the queen's side, but what is he actively trying to do? How is he trying to put some pressure on me? Let's see if you guys can come up with some ideas.
Possibly f4.
Yeah. So in the game, I knew that, just from past experience, I knew that Prateek was a big fan of this f4 game plan, so this is one thing to look out for. But it's actually not the best way to play here with whites. So I was kind of hoping for f4. What else could white try to do? And this is a plan that you guys might have not seen before, but it actually turns out to be very, very serious for black to deal with.
I consider the sack on g6 being a rook lift onto the third rank, and then not immediately, but I'm saying set up for it.
Yeah. So considering some psycho stuff, taking on g6 at some point and trying to go for a massive kingside attack. And that's sort of the textbook plan. Not necessarily, specific sacrifices, but in the Carlsbad structure, the side with the extra pawns on the queen's side is actually somewhat counterintuitively trying to attack on the king's side a lot of the time. But it's important, above sort of all other things in the Carlsbad, to remain sort of flexible. So in this case, even small changes in the position can change your plan pretty drastically. So as black, I'm trying to stay flexible because I see how heavily my opponent is trying to stop b5, so I'm thinking of other ways to play. And similarly, f4 or just vaguely attacking on the king's side is going to be one way of playing, but it's actually possible for white to sort of meet me on the queen's side and try to play on this side of the board as well. And that was the plan I wanted to highlight here just rather quickly. So in the game, I played this move, queen to c7, which turns out to be a pretty good move. The reason being, I am trying to induce this move f4. Now, we listed f4 as one of the moves that white might want to play in combination with trying some kind of kingside attack. But I had some very specific justifications here. So number one, this structure is a little bit different than this structure. And one big thing is it helps me control the f5 square a lot more easily. So after a move like f4, I'm actually not as concerned with f5. It's going to take white some time to build up to this f5 move, and this structure helps me play against that just a little bit. Outside of that, f4, I mention this all the time, comes with some pretty major drawbacks. So let's just list those really quickly. Why would white maybe not want to play f4? Yes, so the one everybody loves to point out right away is it weakens the diagonal. But in this case, it's actually not very relevant, right? This diagonal is pretty locked down. So what else?
Weakens D3.
Weakens, yep, these two squares. Also these two squares, right? Because you can no longer play f3. But even more importantly than that, it actually makes my play on the queen side stronger. So how does that make any sense? How does f4 make the queen side play stronger? Well, the thing that often goes unmentioned is it very much weakens the second rank and indirectly the king. So with the pawn on f2, just imagine a scenario where I'm crashing through on the queen side and things are opening up. With the pawn on f2, it's a little bit easier to keep everything defended, right? One day if the g-pawn gets attacked, it can still step to g3, king g2. Your king has all this nice little shelter with the pawn on f2. With the pawn on f4, there's sort of not a lot in the way of me coming after this king. And so it's a little bit way down the road, but f4 makes some long-term weaknesses, and that's sort of what I was hoping for. So what I think a better plan for white is here is actually two different ideas. You can start with knight d to f3. I think this makes a lot of sense, and you're not worried about the trade. You'll just replace it with the other knight. But I think actually knight to d3 could potentially be a very annoying idea for white in this position. And what's the point? Well, let's imagine I actually do achieve this move b5 one day, and let's put a takes b. Actually, let's not put a takes b on the board. White actually has a really annoying move here. You can insert a takes b if you want, but that's not the main idea. So knight to c5 is definitely connected to the idea, but white can make a change in the structure that might be unexpected, but is actually very, very beneficial to white. So how can white change the structure here in his favor? Which pawn? The A pawn? Okay, so not quite. I mean, already concretely, I think I can capture.
So if he pushes the B pawn, then it allows him to play C4 next.
So we do want to push the B pawn, but not to B3. We're not really playing for C4. We're actually playing for B4, I think, in this position. And this is a plan that can be very, very dangerous for black to deal with because, first of all, white is kind of in control of when the A file is going to open up. That's why I said you can insert it, but you don't really want to a lot of the time because you can do this later. And beyond that, we no longer have any kind of minority attack, first of all. White has voluntarily made a weakness here on c3, but as Tony mentioned here, it's not going to matter because knight c5 is very effective at stopping up this file. And by the way, having a very, very active piece attacking a6, attacking e6, and after getting this huge change in structure on the queen side, then maybe having secured the queen side, white can start to get a little bit more loose over here on the king side. So this is sort of how I thought the game might go. And again, knight d to f3, trying some knight g5 stuff also possible. But instead, my opponent played sort of the worst of all three worlds and played g4. So much like f4, g4 is very, very weakening. But the idea I thought was just not going to be as strong as well, not as threatening to play stuff like g4 compared to f4. So immediately, how do you take control of the game here with black? Black isn't like winning or anything, but you can very much take control with the next few moves. Great Wolf in the chat has asked, did I fall out of my chair when g4 was on the board? Not really, but I did I did lean forward. I was very excited to see the move g4. What was that? Okay, this score's d5. E5. Yeah, knight takes e5. If you meant knight to e4, this is sometimes a move that we want to play. But here, just concretely, we don't have enough defenders. But yeah, knight e5. This is now a very favorable change in structure for black. So white theoretically could just capture with the queen, but I'm not going to be unhappy about, first of all, a queen trade. Second of all, maybe even just play knight to d7 here. And if the queen retreats, look at all these newly weakened squares because this g-pawn has been moved. But also, not really unhappy with this position either. I'm not sure black is exactly crushing it, but this minority attack plan, once again, is going to be on the cards. So in the game, my opponent took back with the pawn, trying to keep the pressure up. So now, this is going to be the common theme, I think, in the games that I show you tonight. So white has made some opening mistakes. And because of those opening mistakes, there are weaknesses sort of littered throughout the board. And so in the 3 games, you're going to see me trying to take advantage of those weaknesses with varying degrees of success. And we're going to see some good play by the quote-unquote weaker player. We're going to see some bad play by the weaker player. And we're going to see some bad play by everybody involved sometimes. So in this game, I think that Prateek did not do the best job of putting up the most resistance. So I wanted to start with this sort of as an example of what not to do if you find yourself in one of these positions. So starting from here, I have to move my knight. So I play knight to d7. Prateek continues out with h4, very, very aggressive. And now I think the next few moves are very easy for black to come up with. They're very natural, but they're also pretty important. So white is doing some scary stuff over here, but we have some really nice tempo moves that bring all of our pieces into the game. So see if you can find maybe a sequence of 2 to 3 moves here that bring the rest of your pieces in. How to activate. So what am I talking about? Yeah, so I'm talking about these pieces in particular, right? Right now, they're sort of looking at a pawn that's defended, but using these weaknesses across the board, we can bring them in. So you said queen to g3. I think you mean queen b6, right? Yeah, so we can definitely start with this. This allows the rook to breathe a little bit. And not only that, it's a tempo move. We attack the pawn on b2. Our opponent has to respond. He came up with knight to f3. Now, how did you want to follow up? So, of course, knight f3 defends with the queen. Yeah, just rook to c4. We bring the rook into the game. Also a tempo move. So our opponent plays knight to d4, trying to stop up our play. I just play rook a to c8 now in the game. This one isn't a tempo move, but now all of a sudden, 3 moves later, we've activated our queen, pressuring this weakness. We've activated our rooks with pressure down the c file, along with the a4 pawn, and even the g4 pawn. And white hasn't really advanced their plans at all. Like the knight moved from d2 to d4, which is an improvement, but all of our pieces are starting to sort of come into the game. Now Prateek plays h5, which I think is good. It's not, whenever you have weaknesses like this, you need to play actively, go for active counterplay. What you can't do is what Prateek started doing after this. So I play g5 in the game, trying to keep things a little bit more closed. Prateek plays a5, pushing my queen back to d8. And then queen to e3. Sorry, then king to g2. Queen to e3 might happen next. Don't worry about it. And so far, so good for Prateek. I actually like how he's been handling things here. So king to g2, does anybody see the sneaky idea with king to g2? What might white have in mind?
Rook h1.
Yeah, white's probably going to try to come after us here. Some rook to h1 and h6 stuff. So just be aware that that's going on. Now, I don't think black needs to go crazy and respond to it right away. Instead, we should look to finish activating our pieces. So how can we achieve that? What's the next piece that we need to activate?
The knight should go to either e4 or f4. E4 is going to be a lot easier.
OK, so you're correct that we need to activate the knight. And you're also correct that these squares look great, right? These squares look sort of amazing. If knight f4 were legal, I would win the game. But you also have to be sort of realistic with your plans here. So knight f4, not really going to be realistic. There's just actually no path to this square on the board. And now knight to e4 also has a problem associated with it. So what might the problem be if we plan to bring our knight to e4?
It can get kicked by the pawn.
Yeah, f3 is actually a very favorable move for white here. It defends the weakness on g4, defends the e4 square, and so there's really no point in trying to bring our knight to e4 if it's just going to have to move away. So what else can we do with this knight? How can we use it effectively?
Knight b8, knight c6.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It might sound weird to try to effectively use the knight by trading it for our opponent's knight, but this knight is really the only thing holding white's position together, right? This knight is single-handedly stopping our rooks from attacking or invading over on the king's side. It's defending all these annoying squares in white's camp, and it's just a great piece. So our knight, knight c5 might look tempting at first because you're heading for squares like e4, but in reality, this knight just doesn't do anything on c5 except maybe get your rook trapped. Immediately, your rook's not trapped, but let's say white plays f3 in response. You don't have a second move, right? Your best move might be knight to d7. So that's why knight to b8 actually turns out to be the correct plan here. White now plays queen to e3, and we're going to follow through with knight to c6. You do have to see one tactic here, but one tactic is enough. So if white had gone for something like this, black is of course winning because of this fork on c2. So that's the only tactic you need to see, maybe in the whole game. So instead, white captures on c6, and I take back with the rook. Now, it turns out that white has one way, and only one way, to maintain the balance here, and it's a very sort of unusual plan. So I would be very impressed if you guys could come up with it, but it turns out he should continue playing consistently. No need to respond to me over here, because if you start responding and defending, then your weaknesses are just going to sort of be the deciding factor. But instead, rook to h1 would have been nice. King to h7 is very natural. And we are just going to meet h6 with g6. And at first glance, this might look a little scary over here on the king's side, but the king turns out to be very, very safe. The h-pawn is a nice shield for us, and white's not going to be able to attack the king very easily. But it turns out there is a very nice plan here for white that I think both of us missed in the game. Would have been a great plan for someone to find, but very, very unusual plan. So if you guys want to take just a second here, see if you can come up with the way for white to play for the advantage. Turns out black is still doing fine if I play well, but it does put the pressure on. What to do? All right, this one's pretty tough. Nobody in the chat's getting it either. It's actually rook h3 with the very specific idea of going rook f3 with the very specific idea of going rook f6, and then this pawn is hard to defend. So if you saw this from afar, then you're a super genius and you're way better at chess than me and Prateek. But both of us missed this idea in the game. Turns out it's just good. Now, in fairness, let's see what line I had here. Yeah, after rook h1, knight takes d4 is what black should do, which makes a lot of sense. King h7, h6, g6, rook h3. Turns out black can even just play f5 here, and this is how the game would have maintained a balance. And despite this being a little bit scary, this rook endgame turns out to be drawn. So that was the only way for white to stay equal. Instead, after knight to c6, this position does turn out to be just very nice for black. I played rook c6 in the game, f3, king h7, rook to d1, and then I had this very, very nice repositioning where I go king to h6, defending the pawn with my king, freeing my queen to join the attack. And now Prateek continues doing exactly what you shouldn't do if you have a lot of weaknesses against a higher rated player. The last thing you want to do is curl up into a ball and just hope that everything stays defended, because it never does in practical games. Sometimes computers will hold positions like this. They will just curl up into a ball, defend their weaknesses, and then, there's just no way to break through. But in human play, especially, non-grandmaster human play, it's just an impossible way to try to play chess. So what should Prateek have done here? I think he should have tried to get active, maybe play rook to d4, and I don't know, hope against hope that he can invade somehow over here, like rook a3, rook b3, just try to get some counterplay or something, even if it's not supposed to work out. Instead, what he does is rook to d3, and after queen to c7, rook to a3. So what is Prateek's idea? Prateek's idea is that after rook to c5, attacking the a5 pawn, he's going to go b4, and I guess his plan is to just leave all these pieces here and hope that I can't break through. So I think that this is a very, very easy way for the higher rated player or the player with the advantage to just sort of play any move that he wants. Like, I can do really anything I want in this position, and I know that I don't have to be worried because my opponent's plan is to sit there and do nothing, just let me try and try and try, and then hope I can't break through. So again, this game is the example, I think, of how you shouldn't be playing when you have a bunch of weaknesses. You have to get active. You have to fight back. You can't just sort of sit back like this. In the game, I chose not to include rook to c5. I think I could have, but instead I just go with rook f4. And then actually the end came very, very quickly for Prateek here. He plays this move, king to g3, which at first looks sort of fine. I mean, it's a move. You have to play a move here with white. You've already set up your pieces on these awful squares and sort of said you're going to keep them there. But it does turn out this one loses to a tactic, which it might seem like, oh, if only white hadn't hung a tactic, then he would have stayed in the game. But eventually, you're going to hang a tactic in these positions. You just can't play them forever and ever and ever and not expect to lose something in the end. But black to move and get a huge advantage here. How can we do it after king to g3?
It's either f6 or f5.
Yep, so just f6. And we're just attacking this pawn twice. And one of the weaknesses has just fallen. Of course, you cannot take this pawn, because rook e4 is going to be check and attacks the queen. So f6, and now black is just winning. And more mistakes happen later in the game, but those aren't quite as instructive. So the game ended like this. I just break through with e5 and e4 now. You can't actually take this pawn, because rook f2 is very, very nice with checkmating threats. And then queen h2, when I'm threatening 1, 2, 3, maybe 4, depending on how you count. 4 ways to checkmate. You can only defend like 3 of them, so the 4th one is gonna end up succeeding. So he didn't take. Instead, he goes king g3. We shuffled around a little bit, and then eventually Prateek allowed me to trade off all the pieces, go g6, and enter this winning king and pawn endgame, which was not so difficult. So this was the first game I wanted to show because things really fell apart in the space of like 4 or 5 moves there for white. And they fell apart as soon as he gave up on attacking me, gave up on being active. He just said, all right, I'm going to curl up into a ball and we'll see what happens. So that is my big example of what not to do. And yeah, James in the chat says, nice game, very clean. Yeah, there's a reason why I blew through the latter half of that game. Mistakes were made, but don't worry about it. The point is, practically, you cannot play like this and expect to hold your position forever, in most cases. So now I want to look at the counterpart to this game, which is my game against another local kid by the name of Vinee Thatiparthi. So Vinnie, as we call him, is another young chess-playing kid in St. Louis who is climbing the rating ladder, and no doubt will be passing me before too long, but I've still got, I think, another year or 2 on him where I can keep pressing. So Vinnie had the white pieces against me, and he chose to play this sort of King's Indian attack type setup. And I was ready for this. You know, it's an invitational tournament. I know my opponents in advance. I know what they play. And so I had prepared this line with g6. So this is how the theory normally goes. Black goes e5. We get this nice central pawn duo, and in return, white is going to try to break down our central pawn duo in any number of ways. In the game, he chose knight to e2, which I wasn't quite as familiar with. The normal move is just knight g to f3 here, but I figured this didn't change too much. I just go knight e7, supporting my center. Probably I chose knight e7 for a very similar reason why Vinnie chose knight to e2. Sometimes it's nice just to have this bishop open. It helps defend your pawn, and if this pawn ever moves, then the bishop can be very, very active. And the knight on f6 is not going to be all that much better than the knight on e7. The main point is we are helping to defend this pawn on d5. And in some instances, I'm going to be very happy to be defending the f5 square as well. Maybe one day white goes f4, f5, and I'm defending it one more time with my knight. So kingside castles for white, kingside castles for black. White goes a4, which is a pretty common move actually in these structures. It's anticipating this change in structure that often happens. So let's say a5. Something that will very commonly happen in these structures is white goes b3 or c3, one of the two. Black wants to go d4, and white will occasionally want to put this knight onto c4. So the idea of going a4 is to preempt some of these b5 ideas. And if black allows you, let's say black just plays like bishop e6, we're going to be very happy to just even gain a little bit more space with something like a5 in these positions. So a4 played by Vinnie, not a bad move. I go a5. And then Vinnie loses his mind. So he takes on d5, which is already sort of really, really strange. I guess his idea is to help open up this bishop a little bit, but I'm able to take back, and now I have 2 versus 1 in the center. You know, opening principles, having control of the center, still a good thing. And then he goes c4. So he's entering the sort of Benoni style structures, and I guess he was hoping that I would push d4, and then he would be able to make good use of the e4 square, of these weakened light squares, and this bishop would be able to sort of wreak havoc, you know, the normal Benoni ideas. Now, there's a problem with this, and that problem is the Benoni is not a very good opening. But there's another problem with this, and that's why the game sort of took a turn for the worse for Vinnie. I'm by no means obligated to play d4 here, and in fact, I just don't. You know, I think it's better to just develop my pieces, so I do so. Knight c3 by white, bishop e6 by black. Vinnie decides it's time to capture, and once again, I want to pause for a moment, take stock. So white has made some pretty serious opening mistakes here and has saddled himself with this permanent weakness on d3. So not quite as many weaknesses as the last game we looked at, but d3 is going to be weak, a4 is sort of weak, it could be attacked, and b2 is also a pawn you definitely have to keep an eye on with the bishop on g7. Now, instead of taking this other approach where you can imagine very easily white trying to do something like, here, I'll play some bad moves, like rook e1, bishop f1, and let's say like rook a3, like really just super ultra trying to defend this pawn over and over again. Like, this would be one way to play. You just try to defend this pawn, try and, you know, prepare for the oncoming assault, and just play like this. Try and keep your pawn defended as many times as possible, and try not to lose it. But this is only going to make your position worse. So what you need to do when you have a weakness like this is not sort of sit back, try and defend the pawn as many times as you can, but instead go for very, very active counterplay. So black's position in this case is not perfect either. You know, a4, a5 being on the board makes my pawns on the queen side just as weak as my opponent's pawns. On top of that, you know, this bishop is now on this wide open diagonal. So I really like how Vinnie treated this position. Even though he's already pretty significantly worse, he was able to find active counterplay and give himself chances. So to start with, he goes knight d to e4. So already he's trying to keep the pressure up against my queen's side. I come up with the move, knight d to b4. So already, you know, I'm trying to target the weakness, trying to activate my pieces. Vinnie immediately plays the move knight to c5. So not pausing for a moment to do anything about the d pawn, instead he's combining active play with defense, you know, bringing the pieces forward, continuing to attack. I play bishop f5, a very desirable move, which does take advantage of a little tactic here. You cannot play knight to b7. Because I think simply just queen to e7 is my idea, and the knight is trapped. Can't get away with it just yet. So instead, Vinnie comes up with this move, knight to b5. Notably again, this pawn on d3 is just hanging. Vinnie doesn't care. He says, that pawn's weak. I'm coming after you. I'm coming directly after your queen's side. And sure, you can take this pawn, but I'm going to take your pawn. And now with the addition of a second knight, I can come back with knight to d6. and you've got serious problems. You've got serious problems. You're no longer up, you're not up a pawn. My weakness is now gone, and my bishop is still reigning supreme over the board. So again, very active play by Vinnie, keeping himself in the game. So of course, you know, I'm going to be thinking as well in the chess game, so I don't take on d3. And instead, just play the simple move queen to e7. You know, he threatened to take my pawn for real this time, so I'm going to defend it. Vinnie, again, does not pause to sort of meekly defend his position, activates another piece, bishop to e3. Of course, I'm going to play rook f to d8. You know, chess is simple sometimes. You just want to put all of your pieces attacking the weakness, activating with tempo. And so what does Vinnie do? He plays rook to a3. So rook to a3 in this instance, I think, is just sort of required. Yes, it is a defensive move, but it's also a very activating move, right? This rook is going to have some potential on these squares. It also steps off of, you know, a long diagonal that might turn out to be problematic for white. And here I think I don't make a mistake. I continue playing well for another couple of moves at least. I go knight to d5. So targeting my opponent's bishop, trying to drive back these pieces just a little bit. Queen to e2 by Vinnie. I play rook a to c8, which does turn out to be a little bit of a mistake. Turns out I can play just more concretely here. I don't really remember the lines. Yeah, just knight c to b4 first, sort of transposing the knights. And then after takes, I'm just going to have the nice bishop pair here, and I can continue to invade and attack these pawns. Instead, rook a to c8 was my choice. Knight to e4 by Vinnie, allowing this bishop once again to see into the position. Also just stepping out of some immediate threats here. So knight to e4, knight takes e3, I decided it is time to play. And then knight to b4. So once again, I'm keeping the pressure up on d3. I'm trying to activate along the c file. And once again, Vinnie just ignores my threat entirely, comes in with queen to b6, and goes for the active counterplay. And you can really contrast this with the last game that was played, where white goes queen e3, rook d3, rook a3, and tries to defend the c pawn. Compare that with how Vinnie's playing here. Like he's attacking my b pawn. He's making use of his active pieces. He's attacking my a pawn. He's going for the active counterplay, not even blinking against these threats to the d3 pawn. Now, because he has made so many mistakes in the opening, he's still going to be worse here. But practically, you can really see how many more chances he has in the game, right? It's very easy for black to play one bad move here and then just be worse. And in fact, that's about to happen. So in this position, I still don't fully remember the most accurate way to play it. Oh, I do actually. So queen to b6 is making like 3 different threats. One threat is to take on a5. Okay, really only 2 threats. White wants to take on a5. White also wants to play knight to d6, attacking all of my weaknesses and activating the bishop. So it turns out I have a pretty subtle move that helps play against both of these ideas, which is bishop to f8. So concretely, that stops the knight from coming to d6. I just control the square enough times. And against something like queen to a5, I can now actually push this queen all the way back home, and then consider stuff like takes on d3. And while I haven't won a pawn here, it turns out that white's pieces are just a little bit disjointed on all these squares, right? You see this bishop opposite this rook. You see this queen sort of hanging out on this open file, and this knight just very loosely defended. Turns out this was the way to get an advantage. Instead, I chose the move rook to c2, trying to activate my own pieces. And Vinnie came up with this really strange move, rook to c3. So I think this was Vinnie playing for tricks a little bit, but it turns out to not be a horrible move. So of course, what was Vinnie's idea if I attack 2 pieces at the same time? He had something in mind.
He could take on d8 and end up with 2 rooks versus the queen.
Yeah, this was his idea. He was hoping I would do this so he could take both my rooks and then have this slightly favorable imbalance in his favor. It turns out I can also do stuff like queen to c5, I think, which is just sort of crazy to me. But of course, I don't have to fall for this, so I play rook takes b2. But again, rook c3, another instance. He doesn't care about his b pawn. He puts his rook on an active open file and continues to keep the pressure up. After rook b2, he plays queen takes a5. I step back with knight to c6. He goes queen to b6. And then here I play the move rook to a2, which gives away the last of my advantage. At the start of this active variation, it was like -2 for black. After a couple slight inaccurate moves, it's only -1 for black. And after rook to a2, it's actually white who might be starting to press for things. So I was just getting destroyed by Vinnie in this game. He makes one opening mistake, and then I slowly but surely give away my advantage. So all he had to do here was find one more accurate move, and then I think the game definitely would have been totally up in the air. So white to move here and keep the pressure on. What can he do? Yeah, just the simple move, knight to c5. And after the game, he told me he shied away from this move because he was worried about things like e4 and knight d4, which knight d4 is definitely one of my main intentions. So e4, attacking this rook, and I guess Vinnie saw something he didn't like here. It's worth noting as well, he used a lot of time to get to this position, so he maybe didn't have as much time as he wanted to figure out all the details. But knight to c5 turns out just to be a very, very good move. For example, if I go knight d4, takes, something like queen back to b3, rook over to e2, bishop f3, my pieces are getting bullied, and white is picking up an extra pawn on b7, right? Now I'm probably going to get some of this stuff back, and at worst I think this is a repetition that white might want to take. Otherwise, having these major pieces all working together can be a little bit scary. But white is definitely surviving and potentially even pushing for more if he wants. So knight to c5, very, very strong move. Instead, Vinnie unfortunately blundered the game immediately with knight e to d6. And I don't know what he thought he saw. I don't know what he was looking at. But of course, I can capture these knights in exchange for my rooks. Then after queen to b7, it looks like there are some very active threats happening to black's position here. You can imagine if I play, let's say, a bad move. Hard to play a bad move here, actually. Let's say I play knight to b8. Then, you can imagine like, oh, bishop to d5, and oh my goodness, all my pieces are attacked. But of course, these tactics just aren't working. I go knight to d8, gaining a tempo against the queen, also defending my king side. Queen comes to b3. I just adjust the bishop back to e6 and play e4, take on d3. And Vinnie lost the game pretty shortly after this. Black is just totally winning now. This pawn is way too strong. I'm actually crashing through on the f2 square as well, and I just have more pieces. So that'll do it. But the point of the game isn't necessarily the result, but everything leading up to this big blunder, knight to d6. Blunders happen in chess, hard to avoid them. But you can really see, like, Vinnie was taking control over this game. He was just a move or two away from being very firmly in control. And it's because he went for this active counterplay. He didn't curl up into a ball once he had some weaknesses. So those were the two big examples I had of this. Against Prateek, unfortunately, in that game specifically, didn't do a very good job of putting up the most resistance. Vinnie in this game, made me calculate my heart out. I was exhausted after this game because of just all these variations that he kept coming up with. All these active ideas made my life very, very difficult, and I was only saved by random chance when his number came up. It was his time to blunder. Happens to the best of us. So questions on these two sort of contrasting games. You've sort of seen an example of each now. What happened in Prateek's game versus what happened in Vinnie's game before I move on to game 3, which is just total chaos. Any questions at all? We talked about a lot of different ideas. All right, so let's move on then to the rematch, Caleb versus Prateek. And I'm actually showing these games a little bit out of order. So this game happened first, chronologically, but it didn't fit as well with the theme of the lecture. So that's why you're seeing it third. So this Prateek guy, while in round 10, wasn't his best showing. He's a very, very scary chess player to play. I've played him 3 times now, and I've scored 1.5 out of 3, and that's only because I'm a luck box. Against the other national master in this event, he also is scoring very, very well. I think he's beaten Julian. I think he's beaten twice and drawn once. No, he's drawn twice and beaten once. So he has a positive record against Julian. Not easy to do. But in this game, I think we're both going to show that nobody in this tournament really understands chess, myself included. So to start with, we're going to see another Carlsbad structure. I promised you it was coming. This is the game. So I played the exchange, Queen's Gambit Decline. These moves are all very normal, just developing the pieces. And of course, this is a normal Carlsbad this time, rather than with the colors reversed. We get castles. Knight G to E2 is my idea. So once again, keeping in mind my plan of going F3, E4, as well as a minority attack. So black plays rook to E8, I castle. H6 is included, which this is a move I don't yet fully understand. Some very, very strong players have started doing this, but for the past 50 years, everybody sort of agreed it was a mistake to play this move. So I don't want to get into that because I don't understand it. People better than me also don't understand it. So H6, bishop H4. He wanted to include it, fair enough. Not going to critique it. He goes knight H5, which is a common idea here, to try and play a little bit against how I organize my pieces with this knight on E2. And also just, it's kind of a freeing move just to trade off these bishops, give his pieces some more space. So I take and he takes. And I play queen to D2. And I played queen to D2 here because I knew this position. If we check in the database really quickly, there should be one game here between Magnus Carlsen and Vladimir Kramnik that continued with knight to D7. And Magnus made chess look easy, as he sometimes does, and won that game without too much difficulty. So I was hoping for that. But of course, what's the idea with queen to D2? Does anybody have any idea of how I might want to reorganize my pieces after, let's say, knight D7? See if you guys can play like Magnus. What's the point of putting your queen on this slightly weird-looking square?
Connect your rooks to allow
Yep.
probably rook A1.
We connect the rooks, and that's exactly right. We want to play rook A to E1. And let me just continue playing like Vladimir Kramnik. Knight to F8. And our follow-up is just knight to C1, which might not be entirely obvious, but the point now is that we have defended our e-pawn twice. And after knight F6, for example, we can go F3. And once again, we've found a way to organize our forces to play for this E4 plan. So this is what I wanted. Now, my opponent, having played me before, has some idea of the plans I like to go for. Maybe he's seen one or two Road to 2000s on the F3 Nimzo, where I play F3, E4 every game and try to crush my opponent. So he took some time at the board, and he played this move F5. So what are your guys' thoughts on this move F5? What's going on here? Why F5?
To put another attacker on E4.
Yeah, another attacker on E4, and just very concretely trying to stop F3, E4, right? That's the idea. He says, all right, I know you, I know what you're about. No F3, E4 against me. Of course, though, if you remember the first game that I showed, I was hoping that white would play F4 in that position, which is basically just F5 with the colors reversed. So what is the downside? It's going to be all the same downsides as before. Number one, in this instance, the pawn might be weak because we don't have a strong knight on E4 just yet. The second rank is also going to be very, very weakened, as well as, of course, things like this light square diagonal might also be relevant in this case. So the question now is your opponent has played this move F5, very concretely trying to stop you from playing E4. So this move probably isn't correct because you've seen the position before. Hey, it's not really great for black to be weakening the position like this, but how can you try to take advantage here? How can you try to take advantage? There's actually a number of things that you can do.
You could switch gears and go for the minority attack, rook B1, then B5.
That's exactly what I did in the game. I went rook A to B1, B4, and decided, okay, if you want to stop me from playing F3, E4, that's fine. Congratulations, you've done it. I have more than one idea in the position. And if I get the minority attack through, if I succeed, then you're going to regret in weakening your second rank. You're going to regret weakening all these light squares in your position. And my minority attack is only going to be stronger because of it. And it turns out that's a perfectly fine way to play it. Now, there are a number of other things you can do here. I actually took a lesson with our Grandmaster in Residence, Josh Friedel, who will be teaching right after me, by the way. And he pointed out that very concretely, Black is underdeveloped compared to white. Our rooks are connected. So moves like knight to f4 are already going to be tempting, with the idea being that we're just immediately going to come in and try to do stuff like rook f5 and make black's life very, very difficult. So concretely, there are some tactical ways you can play for the advantage here. What I did does turn out to be fine. So I actually start with this move, queen to c2, drawing this rook back to f8, which, depending on who you ask, might not be the best idea. Rook might actually be worse on this square. But OK, rook f8, and then I go rook a b1. Black comes out now with queen to g5. And this is my first big mistake in the game. I think it just makes sense continue on with b4, b5, queen g5, not really going to make a severe enough threat for the same reasons that I talked about before. If you want to play f4, I'm happy to allow it because your pieces are just so underdeveloped here. Don't even think about going for stuff like this with your king on g8. Like, you're just dead lost already. So this was another Josh Friedel observation. Why are you worried about f4? Black hasn't developed any pieces. Just continue with your plan, was what he suggested. You can also play something like g3 here, just solidifying, and many ways to be better. Instead, I played the move f4. And it turns out after f4, this obviously creates a weakness of my own on e3. And the best way for black to play now is just to immediately start targeting this weakness, and black is going to be a lot closer to equal than he otherwise should be. Now in the game, Prateek went with queen to g6, the idea being he wants to defend this pawn twice so he can put this knight in front of this bishop. And now I'm able to go back to my initial plan. So b4, a6, a4, bishop b6, and b5. We did it. Minority attack. We're the best. AB, AB, knight d7 is played, and I continue out now with b takes c, b takes c. And as promised, the point of the minority attack is we've traded off our pawn minority in order to make a very severe weakness in black's camp. In this case, that weakness being the c6 pawn. And now if I were a good chess player, I would have played great moves, targeted the c6 pawn, won the c6 pawn, crashed through, taken advantage of all these weaknesses around my opponent's king, and then won the game. And we can pretend that that's what happened, but unfortunately there's 8 minutes left in the lecture, so you get to see what I actually did. Which starts with knight a4, which is a great move. You control the square in front of the pawn. You open up these files to help target c6. My opponent played rook f to c8, and then I don't know if I played any more good moves for the rest of the game. So let's see if you can find one of the many correct ways here that you can press for an advantage. In particular, there's two ideas that I really, really like.
I really like the idea of moving the king to h8 and playing knight g1, knight f3, and then knight e5.
OK, you want to plant this knight on e5, a noble goal. Yeah, I mean, this seems like a reasonable thing to do. The only danger is that if you give black enough free moves, they might actually be able to do something, active as well. Like if you start spending time on king to h1, maybe I'm going to come here. If you come here, maybe I'm going to come here. If you come here, maybe I'm going to come here. And I'm not sure you've improved your position more than black has improved his position, right? All of a sudden, I don't have pressure here, and I'm worried about my king, just a little bit. So that plan is, in theory, good, but maybe in practice, just a little bit slow. We can play a little bit more actively, make black's life a little bit harder.
Rook b7 with the idea of going ahead and taking on d7 and then playing knight b6.
OK, so I like the first part of it, rook b7. This is a perfectly fine way to play. I think this is the most natural way to play if you don't calculate anything concrete. Just want to activate this rook, and I don't think we really necessarily even want to take this knight on c7 with the tactical idea. We just want to have our rook on b7, follow it up with rook f to b1, and eventually we'll go something like knight to c5, or basically, depending on what black does, maybe we'll just invade further. Maybe we will start to activate this knight as well. But we can just activate our pieces. There are all these holes in our opponent's position, so we can activate around them. Now, I think the absolute best way to play here is knight to c5, with an idea you might not expect. So knight takes c5 is probably what black should do. Otherwise, we are going to continue with something like rook to b7 and give black some very concrete problems. And actually, white's point here is to take back with the pawn. And the reason is, this plan was great, but it takes like 5 moves, and this plan takes 1 move and immediately targets both weaknesses in black structure. So this is always an idea to be on the lookout for. If you can change your structure to give your pieces a better square, then this is very often going to be a good idea. And in this case, I think white is pretty close to winning here, like plus 1.5, plus 2, numbers like that, if you ask a computer, just because it's very, very difficult to keep everything under control. And your counterplay as black is not really going anywhere. Instead, I chose a bad move in the form of knight to b6. So my idea was that after takes, which is forced, I could play rook takes, and immediately I have some really nice pressure against this pawn on c6. Now, the downside is that after this move bishop to d7, turns out that black's position is surprisingly tenable. This bishop on d7 is doing all the heavy lifting, defending the weakness on c6, defending the weakness on f5, and it's such a good defender that black can now start to play actively. So I tried knight to c3, trying to get my second piece in the game, but it turns out concretely I was not keeping track of my own weaknesses, and after queen to e6, to play some really awkward moves to keep everything together. I was planning rook to e1 here, but that turns out to lose to knight to f4. So instead, I had to play the very, very awkward rook to f3. Now, already, Prateek, in this instance, played much, much better than in the first game that I showed. He's not going to sit back, play like rook a7 to c7, and defend his weaknesses. Comes rook a1 check. Of course he does. Of course, active play, always going to be more human, and in my opinion, almost always better. I played this move knight to b1, which is probably a mistake. I should just admit, okay, things are going wrong. I need to play rook to b1. Just trade off these rooks and reassess, try to reorganize. Instead, I go knight to b1. He continues playing well, knight to f6. I try to improve my king with h3 and king to h2. Prateek again, playing actively, actually removing a defender from his c6 pawn in order to try and attack me. We see h5 in the game. And then here I go knight to c3, trying to activate and hope against hope to get my pieces in the game. But this move actually just loses by force already. So things have gone so wrong for white. Black has played well enough, activating all the pieces, not meekly defending the weakness, that there's a winning tactic in the form of knight to g4 check. Just turns out this move is very, very difficult to meet. If takes, then takes. This active rook on the first rank, combined with an active queen coming to h6, is just going to be death. Just death for white. So after knight to c3, this was actually missed. He played h4. And the game is going to continue here. Prateek is coming after me, but I'm just in time to trade off some pieces and get a hold of the position once again. From here on out, I play pretty okay, right up until the moment where after a3, I go bishop e2, blundering rook takes e3. So just like Vinnie in the last game, my number was up. It was my time to blunder. These things do happen. But then, unlike Vinnie, I actually could still save the game. I just had to play rook takes e3. And it turns out that this queen takes f4 move is not so bad for me. I may be down some pawns, but black structure is very, very bad, as is this bishop. And concretely, black is not even going to be much better in this position. You'd love to play f4, but there are some serious problems with that, as we'll see. So missed my chance. Instead, I played knight d3. And things continued to devolve from here. White's now down 2 pawns and should just be losing. But because I'm a dirty swindler, the game continued. g5 and knight g6 gets rid of my strong knight, and things start to look pretty hopeless. But I invaded with the queen. We saw some dancing checks. And eventually, Prateek blunders with this move, bishop to e6. Maybe got a little bit frustrated with all these checks, which does allow me to pick up 1 pawn. And then from here, I go queen to c1. And it turns out this is a very, very tough position for black to actually win. With this queen on c1, there are always going to be very serious problems with pushing the g-pawn forward. And maybe white should actually be holding here. Now, in the game, things continued to devolve. I'm going to skip a little bit ahead because it was a long, long game. And we got to a position like this. So black did achieve this move g4. And then from here on out, I go full on swindle mode. So the game continued with g3. I checked, block, bishop d7, queen g5, queen f1, king f6. I bring this bishop back to d3, targeting the f5 pawn. And then we'll see if you guys can swindle with the best of them to end out the lecture here. So Prateek played queen e3, double question mark. What are you going to do to swindle your half point? What can you do? It looks hopeless. Black is going to go here, and then you're in trouble. Black is also going to go here, and then you're in trouble. So if you play like queen e2 or something, you lose some pawns. Things don't go well.
Oh, I see. Okay. You can play bishop takes f5.
Great move to start. So in time pressure, your opponent blundered the stalemate trick. And then if we were both 1,000 points lower rated, he would take on f5, and then I would resign. But of course, rather than resign, I would take on f5 back, and I would then checkmate my opponent's king. Maybe I would just check him forever, or checkmate. And then you take me, and you are putting me into stalemate with a draw. So that's my big trap. But of course, you know, Prateek sees me play bishop f5, like he knows what's up. He knows what's up, right? So he comes up with this nice move, queen to f2, to keep the game going. And then I do my best acting. I say, darn, you saw my trick. And I play bishop back to d3. And very quickly, Prateek takes on f1, and I take on f1, and he plays king f5. And now my position seems hopeless, right? My opponent is going to go here, and then here, and then here, and then I'm in big trouble. So what's the deal? What's the deal? Is it actually hopeless? Is it actually hopeless here? Should I throw in the towel, resign the game? Of course not. But why not? What's my trick? What's my trick? Any Sam Shankland fans in the chat? This isn't quite what Sam Shankland did, but it's close. So Sam Shankland, famous for resigning in a drawn position. Very similar to this. Webster says bishop c4, but unfortunately, I do have a legal king move now, so black could just take this. Also, that would give me a legal pawn move as well.
The bishop should be able to get to f3, and then the king can run over to d1.
Yeah, you can do this, but you're not going to be holding this game. You're not going to be holding this. This goes here, this goes here, this goes here. My king goes here, and then you're in trouble. So of course, we go bishop b5, bishop c6, and bishop takes d5. And it turns out that this endgame is a draw, which you might not expect. So of course, the first idea is that you can never attack g2 a second time, or else it's stalemate. And if you try to be very, very clever and sacrifice your bishop for one of my pawns and go king f3, then I have to go king g1. You go g2. But unfortunately for you, my h3 pawn actually works in my favor here. And after king h2, king f2, I am stalemated thanks to my buddy on h3. And this is actually how the game ended. So after all that, after all those blunders, after all that controversy, game ends by stalemate. So useful to know some of these endgame fortresses. Not that useful, but in this case, it came to my rescue. So what was the point of it all? Well, this last game was a little bit more chaotic, but once again, you see that when you make a bunch of weaknesses in your position, one way or the other, it sometimes happens. You shouldn't just curl up and defend. You need to find active play. You got to activate your pieces, fight back against the opponent, and then you're going to have a lot of chances, as we saw in this game, to end up winning. With that, I think I'm a little bit over time, so thank you all so much for joining me here tonight. Coming up next, momentarily, will be Grandmaster Josh Friedel, who is leaving soon. He only has one more lecture, I think, on YouTube here. So make sure you stick around while we still got Josh, and it'll be a good time. All right, so as always, thank you all so much for watching. My name is Caleb Denby. This has been The Road to 2000, and I will see you next week.